In 1929, President Herbert Hoover said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." Of course, today these words are tremendously ironic because we are only months away from having the greatest economic collapse in history. The unchecked optimism of the 1920s crumbles into the utter despair of the 1930s. Between February 28th and February of 1928 and September of 1929, stocks had risen steadily and rapidly. The stock market was up 40% in this span of 19 months. The volume of stocks traded had jumped from 2 million to 5 million shares. This was, of course, made possible by easy credit. Lots of people wanted to loan money, and a lot of the money that was borrowed being spent in the stock market. We also have a speculation fever of land in California and Florida that is also fueling this massive overextension of debt and investment. Now, this picture, I just want to call your attention to this picture. This is an amazing picture. There in the background, you see a billboard of the 1920s, right? The world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. This happy family with their puppy going for a ride. And then, of course, in front of it, you see this endless stream of unemployed people probably looking for relief or work or something like that. It's an incredible contrast between the 1920s and the 1930s. The economic collapse in the 1920s will be the worst in American history. It's arguable that the 30s will be the worst decade, I should say, economically in American history. Arguably, the last decade, I'm doing this in 2013, have been the second worst decade economically in American history. And some people are referring to this as the Great Recession that we're living in now. In October, stocks begin to slide. And by October 29th of 1929, we have Black Tuesday. 16 million shares of stock are traded on that day, and a 10% loss in the stock market in a single day. Many stocks become completely worthless. By December, just a month later, stocks are down 50% from their high. This slide in the stock market will go on for years, but the stock market did not cause the Great Depression. It was a symptom, not a cause. So let's make sure that we understand what the Great Depression was caused by. Now, this is argued, still hotly contested today, but I'm going to propose 7 potential causes of the Great Depression. One is a lack of diversification. Our economy was so heavily dependent on automobiles and construction that when those industries slowed down, largely because of market saturation, it caused a massive decrease in demand in the economy. The construction industry was $11 billion in 1926. It fell to $9 billion in 1929. That's before the crash. Automobile sales were down by a third in 1929 alone. This meant that other industries like oil, petroleum, chemical, plastics, and electronics are going to fall as well because those are all basically sub-industries of the automobile and construction industry. And so this is going to lead to a sudden decrease in some of the biggest industries in the country, which is going to start this ball rolling. We also have massive income inequality at the time. Yes, America got a lot richer in the 20s, but it was really only the rich people getting richer. The rest basically stay the same. In fact, by 1929, that's right before the crash. That's the peak. That's as rich as we got during this period. Half of Americans are right at or below the poverty line. Well, what this means is they cannot buy the stuff the companies are making. And so we have this problem where the wealth is flowed upward into the hands of a very small number of people, and therefore there's no demand. There's nobody to buy the toasters and washing machines and cars that these corporations that are generating all this wealth are making. The collapse of agriculture, which we'll get into some detail in a minute. As farms are able to produce more and more and more, prices of farm goods fall and fall and fall, which means that farmers are no longer able to pay their loans, and their farms go into foreclosure, and that leads to an economic crisis among farmers, which certainly did not help what was going on in other industries. We had unregulated banking. This is the fourth thing. Banks were recklessly invested in the stock market. And so even, I'll tell you a story. There's a janitor named George Geddes. And he had saved $1 a week his whole life for his retirement. And he was approaching the time when he was going to retire. Now, he had never bought a piece of stock. He had never invested in any risky businesses at all. All he did was put his money into a savings account in the bank. Now, this was not a man who was playing the game. He was not involved in the great casino. But when the stock market crashed, his bank went under. His bank had taken his money that he had done the responsible thing with, poured it into unwise investments in the stock market. And when the stock market collapsed in 1929, George Geddes went down to get his money out of the bank. But his bank went bust. It closed. It said, we have no more money. We can't pay you back. And so he waited all night outside his bank, and when the people came in the morning and told him he was absolutely not going to get his money, the bank had gone under, he went home and killed himself. Now, this is a great example of how it wasn't just the gamblers, which in this case were really the banks, that got hurt by their irresponsibility. It was regular people who did the right thing. But that irresponsibility and that lack of government regulation, the lack of rules on banking, is going to be a major cause of the Great Depression. Another problem was that Europe had rebuilt. Now, you might say, well, that shouldn't be a problem. But it was for us because after World War I and the devastation of World War I, the Europeans were buying a whole lot of stuff from America, particularly foodstuffs. And by the late 1920s, Europe was back on its feet. They had largely recovered from World War I, and they no longer were demanding as many American goods, which hurt the American economy. But a problem that Europe did have was their debt from World War I. Paying the money that they owed, mostly to America, was choking out European economies and reducing the governments over there's ability to function effectively. When they asked America to renegotiate these loans because it might, cause a worldwide economic disaster, Calvin Coolidge said they hired the money, didn't they? Meaning they took out the loans, they have to pay it back. And the Republican administrations of the 1920s refused to work with Europe in any way on their debt, which will cause a collapse of the European economy, which will greatly magnify the collapse of the American economy. Finally, Republicans had, for a long time now, been demanding higher and higher tariffs to stop European goods from competing with American goods. This is protectionism. This prevented Europe from fully recovering economically from its economy and being able to buy American goods and therefore increase American demand. It also stopped Europe from selling its goods cheaply in America, which would have helped rebuild the European economy. And by 1931, the international structure of debt has completely collapsed, and almost every European country defaults on their debt payments and is no longer paying our bankers back, which is further going to exacerbate the economic crisis in America.